I run a prison arts program at the University of Michigan. It's called the Prison Creative Arts Project, and I send about 60 students a week into prisons, juvenile facilities, and Detroit high schools in the state of Michigan to do workshops in visual art, creative writing, theater, and occasionally music or dance when we have the right people. And the work we do is really all about building community and collaborating with others. So I'll tell you a little bit tonight about how the program runs and what kinds of arts programming we do. But before I get too deep into the talk, I wanted to show you some of the artwork created by artists who are currently incarcerated in Michigan. We have an annual exhibition of art by Michigan prisoners that we hold on the university campus every year. Last year, we exhibited 512 works of art by over 250 artists. And this coming year will be our 20th anniversary of the art show, so it's going to be a huge celebration for us.
That is so cool.
It really is. It's very, very exciting for us. And the talent that we find in prisons is extraordinary. This is a man named Billy Brown. His artwork is all composed, I don't know how well you can see it in the slide, with little tiny hash marks that look like stitches. So it looks like he sewed it, but in actuality it's drawn in colored pencil with very, very tiny marks to create texture and pattern. In Michigan, the folks in prison wear blue and orange uniforms, and that's what they look like. This is a piece about juvenile incarceration and also about the family members of prisoners serving time with those that they love. There's a theme that recurs in a lot of the artwork from Michigan prisoners that has to do with juvenile lifers. We have over 300 people in Michigan prison serving life sentences for crimes they committed when they were youth, when they were under the age of 18. And the law was recently changed so that we will no longer be sending people to prison for life sentences while they are still considered young adults, but we're not retroactively going to let out any of the 300 people who are now adults serving time in Michigan prisons on a life sentence for things they did when they were still children. So that's a huge injustice, and one that the folks on the inside have fought hard to change. What's really, really sad about that law is that the people who made it possible for us to stop sending youth to prison for life are not going to reap the benefits of the work that they did in their own lives. They have to be content with the huge victory that they're saving other people, but they're going to continue to serve out the rest of their lives in Michigan prisons unless something else changes. The human body is always a subject of interest for artists, but what's really remarkable about this piece and a lot of the pieces that really study the human form, particularly the female form in prison, is that pictures of that are not allowed in Michigan prisons, pictures of naked women in men's prisons. This is a male artist. And all of the texture and musculature has to be something that he remembers from his life on the outside, because he doesn't have images to work from as he paints. This is a piece about what it would feel like to come home, what it would feel like to get out of prison. I think a lot of people really underestimate the quality of thinking that goes on behind bars and the imaginative capacity of people who are incarcerated. And the artwork that we see in our exhibition really speaks to the fact that people in prison are every bit as thoughtful, creative, imaginative, and capable as those of us in the outside world. People in prison also have a good sense of whimsy and humor becomes something that's really important in the artwork that we see, and in all the different forms, not just the visual art, but in our work in prisons, particularly in performance. Comedy is essential to the work we do, and you see the bright colors and the vivaciousness of the spirit of the artists with whom we work. Speaking of humor, this is one of my very favorite pieces. So folks in prison have to do a lot of imagining of what they would like their lives to be like, and this is a nice comical reference to an idea of being able to be something different than what you actually might see in the mirror, which of course has much more profound implications as well as comical ones. We don't often spend enough time talking about Native peoples in prisons. In the Pacific Northwest, you all have some really incredible cultures and traditions of indigenous peoples in this part of the world that you all have honored appropriately in many cases, and not honored as much as you should in others, because all of us throughout the United States have neglected the legacies of our indigenous peoples. But Native Americans are actually incarcerated at a higher rate per capita than any other group in the United States. And that's a fact that we seldom talk about. Yes, Johnny?
I got a call about 10 minutes ago from Gary Chilcott, who got out of prison this morning after 14 and a half years. He's a native Micmac. Anyway, it's his first day out, and he was in Hamlet, or he was in the Hamlet production with Mr. McGann here at Two Rivers. So,
well, it is a blessed day.
Yeah.
It is a very, very joyful day. Well, I wish that he was here among us. You'll have to carry our spirit to him.
Well, his PO. It's his birthday.
Sure. But we get a lot of really beautiful art from Native American artists in Michigan who are thinking seriously about their culture and their heritage. And the Native American art, like much of the prison art we receive from people of all different backgrounds, has a lot to do with nature and connections to the natural world, which is, of course, something incredibly important to people in prison who, depending on where you are, could spend decades without even something as simple as being able to touch a leaf or a blade of grass. A connection to the natural world is something profoundly human and tactile and part of our sensory beings. So to deprive people of that is a grave injustice, and one that we don't tend to think about when we send people to prison. This is a piece that is bemoaning the situation in Detroit, Michigan, which is a city that is of great importance in our work in the Michigan prisons, because over 90% of the people who are incarcerated in the state of Michigan come out of that one city of Detroit. So this piece is by a native Detroiter reflecting on things that are happening in his hometown. This piece may be a little bit harder to see in the slide because it's done in such soft brush strokes, but this is one of our artists who is mentally ill, and he sees all of his work as a vision. So the arts work is one of the kinds of programming in prison that's very accessible a lot of times to people who do suffer from mental illness, and we're sending more and more people into correctional institutions rather than into mental health facilities because we've cut so much of the budget for mental health funding nationwide. So people who struggle with mental illness are often not able to express themselves in prison and are often taken advantage of by other prisoners. So being a talented artist and channeling your energies into that while you're in prison can actually earn you respect in ways that protect you from some of the kinds of violence or sort of people gaming you, as they would say on the inside, that you might encounter if you didn't have something that set you apart, that made you distinctive and respected by people around you. We also have a lot of, I included this piece because it shows not only a really powerful image that's about birth and rebirth and connection to one's family. There are all of these bodies kind of mixed up with each other, but it also shows a variety of different kinds of brush strokes in the actual painting technique. So I think there's a generalization that things that are made in prison are supposed to look like they were made in kindergarten, that there's a clumsiness to the art, or somehow we infantilize the idea of people creating on the inside, that we should just be proud of people for managing to create something at all, rather than treating people as really superb artists and capable beings who have extraordinary talent. This is a more abstract piece by an Asian American artist, which looks a lot like a Picasso to me. I think there's a lot of cubism here. We have far fewer women artists in our exhibition than we do men, in large part because there are a lot fewer women in prisons nationwide than there are in men. Women are incarcerated at a rate of about 1 to 7 compared to men, and they are the fastest growing population. In fact, girls under the age of 18 are the fastest growing population of incarcerated people, largely because we've started prosecuting them the way we prosecute boys. It's not that women and girls are committing more crimes than they used to. It's that we are more avidly prosecuting women and girls than we did in the past, and prisons can't keep up with them. So I've learned in the few days that I've been in Oregon that you all, like Michigan, only have one prison for women, and I'm not sure what the situation in your women's prison is, but in ours we have some extraordinary overcrowding, and the facility was built as though it was built to house men. We don't take into account in the architecture or in thoughtful design of spaces for how people congregate and live in men's versus women's prisons. In men's prisons, we're very concerned about isolating people and preventing violence and gang warfare, and so we design prisons that are meant to separate people. In women's prisons, it's actually pretty dangerous to be separated from other people because sexual assault, particularly on behalf of officers, is more possible if you're in a space where you can hide. So in women's prisons, the architecture would be better designed to allow for more communal space and places where people could take care of one another as a community, but that doesn't tend to be the way in which spaces are planned for women in prison. And we also tend only to shove them all in one place. So it doesn't matter how many women you lock up in the state, we're going to cram them all into one building and call it a day, because we don't plan for the fact that we're going to continue to incarcerate more women, and yet that's what's happening. So the troubles that women suffer in prison are very particular to their gender, as well as the sufferings that all people endure in captivity. I love this piece, in part because it is both a self-portrait and something that is really imaginative. This artist is showing himself lying on his bunk in prison, and that's what the bunks in Michigan prisons look like. I haven't seen one in an Oregon prison, but you're basically sleeping on a concrete slab with only a couple of inches of mattress when you're in a Michigan prison or in a lot of states in this country. And in a place like that, somebody was able to see and create this, which I think is an extraordinary gift to us all. Thoughts about families and children are recurring themes in prison art, because we tend to, just like cutting people off from the natural world, prisons cut us off from those we love. And a lot of folks, particularly women, don't get the chance to see their children grow up. A lot of people don't realize that if you are being taken away to prison, if you're being arrested or pulled into the court system and there's not an adult in your family present to take your children at the moment of arrest, you usually, depending on which state you're in, have 72 hours in which to find your children in the system and recover them before they become in protective custody of the state, and then you need a lawyer to get them back. And a lot of people who are working class and without resources and without know-how don't know how to go through that process. When men go to prison, it's much more likely that somebody else in the family is still around to catch those children when they fall and to take care of them. But when women go to prison, it's often the case that there's nobody there to take the children on site at the moment of arrest. The children are much more likely to disappear into the system, and women are much more likely to lose their parental rights because of incarceration than men. That said, this piece was actually created by a male artist. There's another image of nature in Michigan prisons. And you see a lot of fences, too, which I guess is kind of an obvious reference. You see a lot of fences in prison and a lot of bird imagery, because birds are one of the only animals who can come into your life across the fences. And the Prison Creative Arts Project, the organization that I run, has a sandhill crane as our logo. It's the largest bird that passes through Michigan, and they sometimes land and nest in prison yards. So it's a connection to the outside world and a sense of freedom. A lot of portraiture in prisons. In fact, portraiture is one of the first things that prison artists learn to do, because you can make money doing it. People will pay you to draw pictures of their families from photographs, to draw images of other people. And so a lot of people become artists as a kind of hustle to make money for commissary in prison. And then many of them, like the fellow who made this piece, turn into rather refined artists with incredible composition and very thoughtful, technique-driven work, rather than just somebody who was drawing your neighbor's friend or wife from a postcard picture in order to send it back out again. A lot of interesting self-portraiture, much of it involving the idea of breaking through a barrier of some kind. And this is a particularly beautiful rendering of that kind of piece. We also see a lot of art that is inspired by various different cultures. I talked a little bit before about Native American culture. This one is inspired more by African culture. But that's a thing that we tend to elide from the prison population as well, which is a tie to greater cultures and communities than the one of which they are a part in prison. The idea that you are labeled a prisoner or a criminal is often so strong that we tend to disassociate those people from any other history or culture or community. And so creating art that honors the legacies of your past and of your family and culture is a way of tying yourself to the outside world in meaningful ways. There's also a lot of study in prison, a lot of history. This is a piece called The Migration, and the artist was thinking about how his people got to Michigan. So he was from a family historically from the South. They ended up in the North because of the factory work that people were following out of the agricultural life in the South, looking for something different in the cities of the North. And you also see pictures that are about prison life. This is one artist's rendering of what happens on the yard in prison. So I will stop there with the showing of art and pull up the lights and talk about a couple of other things. One of the things that I wanted to mention to you in connection to the art is that folks in prison create art because they need it to live. So one of the first artists that I met in a Michigan prison, I came to Michigan from the University of North Carolina where I had been teaching before, and I ended up in Michigan because I was actually studying this particular program that I am now running. I didn't know they were going to hire me to run the place when I first started working with them, but I came to find out what they were doing. I wanted to know what kinds of arts work was happening at the largest prison arts organization that I could find, and one of the first things they did was to start taking me into prisons to look at this art in preparation for that year's big annual exhibition of art by Michigan prisoners. And in one of these first prisons that I wandered into, I met a man named Robert Doctor, who I'm very happy to say is now home, living and walking among us. But when I met him, he was like all the artists we meet before the art show, standing in front of a table where he had laid out all of the paintings that he had done in a single year. And his paintings were extraordinary. They're all versions of self-portraits, but he draws himself as this little cartoonish guy with a really tiny body and a giant sort of oddly shaped head. So very imaginative, very playful, and the one that I was looking at in front of him was called Escape. And it's this little guy with no clothes on, running through a field, smiling, going like this. And he's this cartoonish little fellow with the oddly shaped head. But that was how he saw himself. That was what escape looked like to him. And there are other really funny pictures in this lot of things in front of him that involve him kissing a frog and doing all of this crazy stuff. But he's always this little cartoony guy having a good time. And I asked him what it meant to him to create this art, and he immediately started choking up, and a tear rolled down his face, and he said, "I don't know how else to say this. The fact that you people come here once a year to look at my art is what keeps me alive." He was suicidal before he became an artist. And the idea not just that he could create, but that somebody would take his art into the world and show it to other people, and in a sense, free a piece of him, because at that point he didn't know he was coming home. That somebody could take something that was such a part of his soul and release it into the world, into the hands of people he'd never seen before, in a gallery in a place like the university, was enough to keep him alive. And we only go once a year into the prisons to collect art for the art show. And the vast majority of people in Michigan prisons are in parts of the state that are too far for us to do our weekly workshops. So my students, the 60 students who go in each semester, can only get to the prisons that are within about an hour and a half driving radius of the city where we live. And the rest of the folks, a lot of the people in the Upper Peninsula, which is where most of the prisons are, we see just once a year when we go to pick up their art. So what we do, yes, Nancy.
How do you decide what art is going to come out and go into the show? How do you?
We take a committee of people. So we have students who want to be a part of the planning of our art show every year. And there may be a dozen of them over the course of the semester who will come and meet with us once a week throughout the fall and plan the series of events that we host on campus during the 2 weeks of the art show. So if you ever want to come to Michigan, I invite you to visit us. Our gallery exhibition takes place late March and early April for 2 weeks. And in the time leading up to that, all through the fall semester, we're planning what's going to happen in those 2 weeks. We bring speakers to campus, we have performances. In fact, that's how I first got to PCAP. I do a one-woman show about people who have family in prison, and they invited me to perform. And that's how I found out that these people existed. And so we plan which speakers we want to invite. We let the students nominate people that we should bring. We have meetings throughout the semester. And then if the students come regularly to those meetings, they get to go on art selection trips in the period between January and March. You're going into all of the prisons in the state. So we'll say, okay, there are 5 prisons in Jackson, Michigan. We're going to hit them all in one day. And you 5 people on the committee get to go to these prisons because it works in your schedule. And then you 5 people will go to these prisons over here. A really special group takes spring break to drive all the way through the Upper Peninsula in the snow and hit all of those prisons up there in the course of a week. So different people go to different facilities, and we go in as a curatorial team. So there are 5 curators, adults who are on staff or local arts people in the community, faculty at the university, and people who we've worked with for a long time, who are at least one of those 5 curators is on every selection trip to help guide the students. So we're looking not just for quality of technique, but mostly for originality of thought. So you get a lot of, there's certain kinds of art that recur in prisons throughout the world, and many of you who do prison work may have seen them. You get a lot of things that look like tattoos. You get a lot of hearts and teardrops and crosses. You get a lot of portraiture that is exactly like the photograph that somebody sent in. And all of those things can be done really well, and if they are done with high-level technique, we'll take those kinds of things. But we're more interested in people really pushing their creativity, thinking beyond the conventional, and expanding their horizons. So we're looking for people to do work that's really innovative. One of my favorite pieces from last year's show, we take 3D work as well as 2D. Most of it is 2D, but we went into this prison in Coldwater, Michigan, which is down on the southern border, and there were a lot of artists at this prison. It's a prison that's really doing a great job of encouraging people to engage in the arts. And there's a papier-mâché artist who likes dragons. And every year he makes a couple of really extraordinary dragons, usually about this big, to give to us. This year we walked in and he had a dragon carousel. It was this big around and this high. And it worked. It worked. It spun around and the dragons went up and down on their carousel poles. And each dragon had a totally different personality, and he took the time to show us all of them, that some had wings and some were meant to live in the water, and some were angry and some were like children's story dinosaurs, and all of the scales on each dinosaur, these little teeny tiny scales, were made with nail clippers. So he had taken paper and clipped them with nail clippers, and all the little teeth and the little claws, I mean, intricate, teensy tiny work he had made by rolling toilet paper and dipping it in glue and paint and putting it on the carousel. And the last thing he said to me before we took, because of course we took it, right? We only take up to 3 works of art from each artist, but we were having the dragon carousel. Come hell or high water, that was going home with me. But when the last thing he said before we took it out of the prison was that he really hoped that somebody would buy it and put a motor in it so that it would turn of its own volition, because right now you have to do it with your hand to make the dragons go up and down. But he had tried to build an engine for it and couldn't quite make it work. Things kept breaking in his engine. But that's how thoughtful and how much time and energy he put into this piece of art. So that's a really long answer to your question about how we select things, but it's a terribly exciting and really enriching process. And the best part about it is not even the art, it's the artists. It's getting to meet these amazing men and women who pour their souls into this work that we have the privilege not only to view, but to carry out to the outside world, where we then mat it, hang it in a gallery, and invite as much of the public as we can possibly get through the doors. I think 3,000 people came to see the show over the course of 2 weeks last year, and it was a great, great gift. So the first story I wanted to tell you tonight was the story of the art show and my friend Robert Doctor, who was kept alive by the ability to bring us art. The next story I want to tell you is also about someone who I think, whose life I believe was saved by involvement in the arts. His name is Chris, and he is one of, not a juvenile lifer, but he came to prison at a very young age, and he will serve a very long time. So in Michigan, we have a facility. For those of you who don't know the Michigan map, it's shaped like a mitten, and there's a facility in this part of the mitten that looks like a thumb, and it's called Thumb, because don't have a very original name for the prison, but Thumb Prison, which is in a place called Bad Axe. There really is a city called Bad Axe, Michigan, where you would put a prison of all things. So you drive out to Bad Axe, Michigan, and you find one of the saddest places on earth, because this is a fully functioning adult male prison, maximum security, where we also house boys in the same facility. So all the boys who get sent to Thumb are boys who are going to be there until they're old enough to be in the adult population. And it is a devastating place to have to go to, and it's devastating both for the youth and the older men who are there, because they're looking at each other and seeing themselves across boundaries that divide them. So the boys are kept separate from the men, but there's the sense that everybody's there together. The beautiful thing about Thumb is that some of the adult men are trained as mentors to help the youth who are going to have to adjust to a long life in an adult male prison. And they actually do tutoring, they try to counsel the boys through their time there, and the select group of mentors sort of stays with the boys through their maturation and graduation into the adult system.